Welcome, everyone. We'll start with the land acknowledgement. So McMaster University stands on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and is directly adjacent to Haldimand Treaty territory. The wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. We must acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and recognize a responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. Our speaker today is Hanna Fang. Hanna completed her master's degree in kinesiology at McMaster University, and she has worked in several labs since graduation, including in the School of Rehabilitation Sciences with Dr. Ada Tang. And Hanna has graciously agreed to speak to us today about the Canadian Common CV, what it is, and how to use it. Hanna, thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. As mentioned today, I'm just going to talk about the CCV. I'm just going to share some of my experience working as a research assistant over the years and how I've kind of navigated the CCV system. So the Canadian Common CV provides researchers with a single common approach to gathering CV information. And it allows researchers to have a generic CV template that can then be customized for different funding agencies. So the idea behind this is that it allows for more standardized CVs, as well as a quicker way to create different CVs for different funding opportunities. So you'll likely need to or have already created a CCV when you apply for grants. So examples of agencies that use a CCV include the Tri-Council funding agencies, which are CHR, NSERC, and SSHRC, as well as the Heart and Stroke Foundation Canada, Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada, just to name a few. So CCV has a generic CV and a specific funding CVs, and they serve slightly different purposes. So the generic CV allows you to capture or view all your CV information with minimal rules. So you would use the generic CV to enter all your information as well as to update it when necessary. However, most of the funding organizations only ask for a subset of the information that's available in your generic CV when applying for any funding opportunities. So if you want to capture only the information required by the funding organization, you would want to use a funding CV. And using a funding CV will apply the rules specific to that organization, and it'll flag any records that don't comply with those rules. So for example, some funding opportunities may request publications only from the last 5 years. So not all the publications that you have inputted into your generic CV will be used. So when you're updating your CCV, make sure you're using the generic CV to input information. A funding CV will only allow you to populate the sections relevant to specific funding agencies. So anything you put into a funding CV will appear in your generic CV, but you will not be able to update all the sections of your CCV. So this might mean you will miss some sections for funding opportunities further down the line that ask for different sets of information. So these are the sections that you will see in the generic CV. Demographic sections like personal information, education, and employment likely won't need to be updated often, but depending on where you are in your academic career, sections like research funding history, teaching activities, and supervisory activities may need to be updated more frequently. And it does take a bit of practice to kind of figure out where to enter the information as well as how to enter it, but it does become easier to navigate over time. The presentations and publications are usually sections that lead to more frequent updating. So just make sure you go back and update any changes that happen. So for example, if a journal article was submitted, but then it gets accepted or published, you might need to go back in and change the publication status, or if the paper is resubmitted to a different journal article, you want to make sure that information is up to date. So as you can see here, there are a lot of different sections. This is because a goal of the Common CV is to capture data relevant to many different disciplines. So within the generic CV, information or categories can range from conference publications all the way to musical compositions. And as you progress through your career, you may have entries for more and more sections, but there may still be many sections that you won't have any relevant information for. And there are also sections that need to be updated much more frequently. It takes a lot longer to update and complete a CCV than you might anticipate, and anyone that has created a CCV can probably attest to that. So make sure you keep track of changes to your CV, such as any presentations, new paper submissions, students that you've supervised, and update your CCV when you have a few items accumulated rather than waiting until you need it for a grant application. I know that's easier said than done, but it does save you a lot of time when you are on a time crunch to meet a deadline. So if you have a copy of your CV on a Word document, for example, you can track changes there, or you could just simply keep a list of new things that you've done and that you need to enter. And that way, you don't have to try to remember what you've done and track down all the details every time you need a CCV for a funding opportunity that comes up. And to add a new entry or edit existing information, you can click on the pencil icon, and that will open up the section that you want to edit. So we could take a look at a journal article page in the generic CV as an example. So these are some of the fields that you will need to fill out when you're entering a journal article entry. Some fields might require you to type in the information, and others might be a drop-down menu where you just choose a relevant option. So such as publishing status, from the drop-down menu, you can see there are a few options that you can choose from, which include accepted, in press, published, revisions requested, or submitted. And like if I mentioned before, if your publishing status of your paper changes, you could come back in here and just update the publication status and input the volume, issue, and page range information. And if there are any fields that you're unsure of, CCV has the help bubbles that you can click for more information. So that's a question mark within the blue circle, and it'll provide you a little more information about that field. So if we could just quickly go through what it might look like to fill out a page. So here is a citation from an article from the MaxStroke lab, and I'll use the citation here to fill out the relevant information on the page. So as you can see here, the first item is article title, and the title here is Long-Term Membership in Cardiac Rehabilitation Benefits Cardiorespiratory Fitness and Skeletal Muscle Strength in Men with Cardiovascular Disease, a retrospective review. So you can either type or just copy and paste that into the article title field. This article was published in the Journal of Cardiology. So again, you could type or copy and paste that information into the journal section. It was published in volume 35, issue 10, and pages 1359 to 1365. So you could type that information in. We'll know that it was published. You could select that from the drop-down menu, and it was published in 2019. So you can type in that information. I've generally found that the information that you could find on a citation for a publication is enough information for the CCV. So I don't usually include information such as the publisher or publication location, but this can change depending on your funding opportunity or even within your field, different fields. So just make sure you double check that information when you're applying for a grant. So I usually don't put any information for description or contribution value or the URL. But I know that the journal is refereed, so from the drop-down menu, I'd select yes. It is not a open access journal, and it is not a synthesis, so from the drop-down menu, you can select no. The options for contribution role are co-author, co-editor, first listed author, first listed editor, or last author. So in this example, let's say if I was inputting this for Dr. Tang, I would select last author. Next, you can list all the authors. So you can copy and paste that from a citation and just put it into the authors section and field. I don't usually include the editor. Usually that information is not needed in funding CV, at least that I have worked on. And I would include the DOI. So when you filled out all the applicable fields, make sure you scroll all the way back up to the top and click on the Done button to save your entry. Otherwise, you'll lose all the information that you just inputted. But as you can see, you would have to enter information field by field and one by one. So it is a lot of items to enter, and it will take a while to do, especially if you have a lot of items to enter. So make sure you give yourself a lot of time to complete this. Sometimes, even if you keep track of as much information as you can, there might be missing information that you just need to find. So like I mentioned before, if a paper was accepted and it's now officially published, you would likely have to go find the volume, issue, and page ranges. So that's what you might find in a generic CV. So next we can take a look at a funding specific CV. This one, for example, is the CHR BioSketch, which is required for CHR project grant applications. So when you're applying for a grant, make sure you carefully read your funding call to ensure you're using the correct CV type. Even within the funding agency like CHR here, they may ask for different CV types based on the grant. So as you can see here, CHR has academic, BioSketch, IAB, knowledge user, and registration. And the CV type required may also depend on the role. So for example, as a principal applicant or principal investigator, you may have to provide a different CCV than a co-applicant or a co-investigator. So just make sure when applying for grants, you just have the right CCV template from the very beginning, because this may negatively impact the evaluation of your application. And as you can see here, the CHR BioSketch is just a subset of what is available in the generic CV. When you select funding templates, it will only pull the required information for that funding. But as I mentioned before, using a funding CV will apply the rules specific to the funding organization, and this will flag any records that don't comply with the rules that the organization has set. So in the case of CHR BioSketch, you cannot select more than 5 entries for a presentation, which is flagged here with a red X. So as you can see here, the 6 out of 190 presentations were selected. So that's one too many, and it will flag it for you to come back in and take a look. And you cannot select more than 10 entries for supervisory activities, which is flagged here by the red error message. So anywhere you see a red X or an error message, you can click on the pencil icon to edit, and it'll let you know what the error is. So in this case, I've clicked into presentations, and it says at the top in bright red message that you cannot select more than 5 entries of presentations to submit to CHR BioSketch. And you can resolve this error by only checking 5 presentations to submit. So if you have multiple presentations, you can definitely strategically choose which ones to include based on the funding call. And you would do the same for supervisory activities. Just select the 10 most relevant that you want to submit. And when you're addressing the errors, you do not want to delete any records. You can just simply deselect the ones you don't want to include. If you delete an entry, it will delete it from your entire CCV, and you'll have to re-enter all that information. which can be a major pain. So just make sure you don't delete, but you just check the entries that you want to include. And only those that are checked will show up on your final CCV. So this is the same journal article that we entered previously in generic CV, but in CIHR BioSketch. If you input information in your generic CV, it will show up in your funding CV. But as you can see here, there are a lot fewer fields than in the generic CV, as CIHR only requires a certain set of information. So compared to the generic CV, this doesn't have fields like publisher, publication location, description, or contribution value, contribution role. But certain fields are mandatory, as indicated by the asterisk next to the fields. So if you're missing any of these fields, a red X will appear and it will flag the error, and you won't be able to submit your CCV until you've entered the required information. And when a section contains no errors, you will see a green check mark. When everything is filled and everything has a green check mark, you can then preview to get a draft of your CCV to review before you officially submit it. So when you click preview, a PDF version of your CCV will be created. And this is an easy way to see your entire CCV and identify any changes that may be needed. You can make as many changes as you want. So if you download a draft and you notice a mistake, you can go back in and update that and then submit another preview and download as many drafts as you need. Or you can simply make a note of it throughout the draft file and then come back in and make all those changes and then download another draft to review again. And once you have corrected everything, you find that everything's right, you can click submit. And this is an example of a draft of a CCV. So at the top, it will flag that this is a draft version. So make sure you don't accidentally submit this, as the funding agencies would probably frown upon having a draft copy submitted. I've only included a few pages here, but it will have everything that you've selected for submission in one place. And it's way easier for you to view and check for any errors. But it can be many, many pages long, depending on how much information you have included in the requirement of the funding call. And if you notice any more errors, like I mentioned, just go back into CCV, go back into that entry and make the changes. So for example, let's say you've noticed you've entered the wrong year for one of your journal articles. Just go back in, look for that entry under journal articles and update that information. And then you can generate an updated draft to review again for errors. So once you've submitted, you will receive a confirmation number. Depending on your funding agency, they may ask that you provide the confirmation number, or they may require that you upload your final CCV. If a funding agency requests a PDF of your CCV, you can use the history tab at the top there to download a PDF copy of your submitted CCV. And if you notice any errors after you've submitted, you can still go back in and make changes, but you would just need to remember to submit again, and this will generate a new confirmation number that you can submit, and you can download a new draft or a new copy of your submitted CCV from the history tab. And if you're applying for multiple funding opportunities that require the same CCV type and you don't have any changes to make, you can simply provide the same confirmation number to the different funding calls. And when you download a submitted CCV, the top portion includes the date submitted, the confirmation number, and the template. But otherwise, the rest of the file would look the same as the draft. And if you've submitted multiple times, make sure you check the time at the top of the page, time and date at the top, to ensure you have the most recent copy to submit. And that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions?
Hannah, how much time should students set aside to work on a CCV?
The first time I had to create one took me a while. You definitely have to look for information. You definitely have to kind of look through it multiple times, and it takes a while to enter. So I would give yourself a few days just so you're not stressing, not missing important information that you have.
Are there important things students might overlook? Like, for example, under recognitions, what are some of the things we might want to enter there?
If there's anything that any awards, any kind of honors, make sure you include that. Yeah, anything that you've done that would look good on a CV or like a job application, you definitely want to include in your CCV as well.
Is there anything we don't want to include?
If you're further along in your career, some information from the past may not be as relevant, but let's say you've had like a part-time job in high school, that's definitely something you don't want to include. Make sure all the information you include is relevant kind of to your kind of current career, less so what you've done in the past that's not as relevant.
So we have a question from Kenny. If I'm not mistaken, there are different sections for conference presentations versus published conference abstracts. If my abstract I presented at a conference is published, which do I list it as?
That's a tough call. Usually you want to make sure you have it in one place. So if you put it in published abstracts and have it there and not in the other place.
So you wouldn't have it in there twice?
Yeah, usually if it's the same entry, you don't want to have it in twice.
I kind of have a follow-up question to that. So say you were listed as an author for a conference presentation, but you didn't do the presentation. Would that be an opportunity to, and then it's like after the conference and it's published, would that be a good opportunity to put in like published conference abstracts as opposed to the presentation section, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, definitely. If it's a published abstract and you weren't the presenter, I think it would work best in kind of published abstracts. Okay. But like for some of the CCVs I've worked on in the past, like they've included presentations that they didn't present themselves, but they were listed amongst the presenters because they were part of the work.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So Diego asks, I don't know if you said this, but if I participated in different congresses with the same work, is it valid to register on the CCV? Yeah,
I've definitely entered the same work at different conferences because you did present multiple times. So it is definitely relevant for you to include because you did attend different conferences. So Kenny says, I had a CIHR reviewer say I didn't present anything after putting it in the conference abstract section. Yeah, I think it also varies for funding opportunities and different agencies sometimes. Even with CCV, the funding agency looks at it differently. And reviewers sometimes also make mistakes. Yeah. Okay, so I want to thank you so much, Hannah, for taking time to make this excellent and very thorough presentation for us. And good luck, everybody, on writing your grants and tackling the CCV.